The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is the Let's Talk Faith and Climate webinar training, co-hosted with the Episcopal Church and Blessed Tomorrow. My name is Anita Cruz. I am the director of Blessed Tomorrow, which is a faith engagement program of ecoAmerica. And we are joined here today with a group of folks from across the country who are interested in learning more about how to connect their faith and climate and talk to others about it. And we are going to hear from several folks. I am going to turn the webinar over directly to Melanie Mullen, who is the Director for Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care with the Episcopal Church, to go ahead and get us started. Melanie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for helping us and leading us in this effort. I am the Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care for the Episcopal Church.
Melanie, are you there?
Yeah, she's talking. It's fine.
Oh, I am here, and can you hear me? That's important.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome, and representing the work of General Convention and our desire to equip and promote the ability of all members of the Episcopal Church to engage in climate justice and climate action. And so part of our offering today would be to start with a prayer. So would you all join me in prayer? The Lord be with you. Oh, Heavenly God, you filled the whole world with beauty. Open our eyes to behold your gracious hands and all your works. That rejoicing in the whole creation, we learn to serve you with gladness for the sake of the one through whom all things were made, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And so once again, just to thank you as we start on this prayerful, activist, and engaging method of doing God's work, doing mission in all of creation. And I'd like to turn it back over to Annie to get us started.
Great, thanks, Melanie. So again, we have today's presenters, which is Reverend Melanie Mullen, myself, Anita Cruz, and we'll be joined in a moment by Meighen Speiser, who's the Chief Engagement Officer with ecoAmerica, and she is responsible for conducting all of our marketing and research work, which we're going to go into great depth here in a little bit. So I'll just quickly review the agenda and then turn it back over to Melanie to talk a little bit about what the Episcopal Church is doing in the realm of care of creation as part of the Jesus movement. So we will talk a little bit about faith values and why the Episcopal Church is leading on climate, some of the findings from a recent survey that we conducted together on what Episcopalians think about climate change, which is important for us to base the communications work that we're going to be practicing together towards the middle and end of the training, which will get us into that, the guidance and workshop. And then we'd like to just invite you all to continue to stay connected with us with some of the ongoing offerings that we'll be working with you all on in the coming months. So Melanie, I'll turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the Episcopal Church's work, and we can play the video whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. A little bit about how we are engaging in our climate work. Beginning in 2015, there was a particular emphasis at a General Convention that mandated that the Episcopal Church engage in care of creation. It mandated that we start a task force or advisory council of people throughout the church to lead us in that work. But it also meant that our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, led us in prayerful reconsideration of doing the Jesus movement as part of our climate change in action. And there are people already in the Episcopal Church in our infrastructure who have been doing this work for a long time. And therefore, we have not only the Office of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, who are working on how do people in the pews in our daily lives think about care of creation. We also have our ongoing work coming from the Office of Government Relations that is led by our folks in Washington, D.C. And let's see if Rebecca is online. Give you a minute to say hi.
But we actually don't.
Thanks so much, Melanie. If you can hear me,
I can.
Again, I'm with the Office of Government Relations in Washington, and we take on the federal advocacy component of all of the varied parts of our work on care of creation and climate, and are happy to partner very closely with the Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care. So I will turn it back to you, and happy to be a part of this. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, and so a lot of people wonder, what's the difference between what we've always done, sort of advocacy about climate care on the Hill, and thinking more deeply and prayerfully about doing the Jesus movement for care creation. And I'm reminded of something that Bishop Curry has once said, that he's got a faith, and we all share one, that teaches us to welcome the stranger and the immigrant and the vulnerable. And for those of us who are prayer book praying people, that includes all of us who are at times sharing in the vulnerability, the hope, and the peril that can come from environmental degradation and climate change. And where we get our emphasis is right back in the Book of Common Prayer. With the apostles' teaching, we pledge for every baptism that we will continue in the work of caring for God's creation, respecting all humanity, and striving for justice and peace amongst all people. This care for creation is a part of what we're understanding to be a critical component of what it means to be a baptized Christian and an Episcopalian. And so, along with Bishop Curry and all those members of the Episcopal Church, we are looking into our own churches, our dioceses, our provinces, to think about places like in the Diocese of Virginia, where people are experiencing flooding at higher levels than ever before, or in the Diocese of Maryland, where there's cities of Baltimore where children are experiencing the impacts of climate change on their health and well-being. And we all know about the incredible work of the Episcopal Relief and Development and all those Episcopal churches throughout the Southwest and the coastal areas that dealt with the hurricanes of Maria and Harvey, where they were forced to deal with what were once in a lifetime storms becoming more and more frequent. So Episcopalians know that the impact of climate change is important, that it affects our lives from Alabama to the Northeast to the Northwest and all of the 70 countries in which we're present. And so we're hoping that we can engage ourselves prayerfully and spiritually in Scripture and a Book of Common Prayer and our values and tradition to engage in climate change. And next slide.
Do you want me to play the video here now? Or?
Yes, please. There is a wonderful video with Bishop Curry inviting us into consideration of this important work.
Great. So we'll go ahead and play that now. And you can find this on the Episcopal homepage or blessedtomorrow.org as well.
All of God's creation is a part of the very family of God, the entire created world and universe. We see the beauty and the majesty that God has created. We have been charged with being caretakers of God's creation, and in so doing to be co-workers with God in the saving work of restoration and reconciliation. If you don't believe me, read Genesis 1. The work we do for the healing of creation is simply joining in God's saving work. This is not secular do-goodism. This is the Jesus movement. As followers of Jesus, we care for God's world because God cares for God's world. This means that we care about climate change. The Episcopal Church is growing in our dedication to this urgent movement by helping to turn love into action, and we can do it. Already, we have a unique place in the worldwide climate movement, with communities of faith in 17 countries throughout the United States, Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Since the 1970s, the Episcopal Church has been a champion in protecting the environment that we all know and love. We already pray and advocate for climate solutions and for the most vulnerable among us who will bear the biggest share of the hardships of climate change. We pray and we hope for our children and for their future. People may wonder, why do we care? Why would a church be present? We answer, how could our church do nothing? Jesus is moving in the healing and redeeming of human society. We must be there too, for we follow him. My prayer is that we in the Episcopal Church will work to solve climate change in our homes, in our churches, in our communities. Today, we are continuing our work by partnering with ecoAmerica's Blessed Tomorrow program, a program which unites people of faith to act on climate change by giving us the tools, the resources, and the messaging we need to serve as stewards of God's creation, even in the midst of difficulties and setbacks. God's work goes on. Our work must go forward too. This is God's world. We are God's children. He's got the whole world in his hands. May God bless our hands as we strive to be faithful in this holy and important work.
Great, I'll turn it back over to you, Melanie.
Great. So as you heard Uncle Curry's, the presiding bishop's wonderful invocation for all of us to do this work, we've been doing this work for a while, and this video was broadcast at our 2018 July General Convention before several thousand of Episcopal leaders who are setting the agenda for this triennium or the next 3 years. And there are, in addition to thinking about this thematically and spiritually, there were over 10 resolutions that we voted on to support to show our work doing this sort of important climate change work. And I just wanted to, once again, open up and offer our Office of Government Relations Director a chance to sort of explain the link for us when doing this work and all of the wonderful pieces of advocacy that we are encouraged to do or mandated to do thanks to General Convention. Let's see, is Rebecca can join us. Well,
yes, thank you.
There you go.
Great. Exactly. As Melanie pointed out, there's a whole range of issues that we're looking to address that are the specific ones, looking at care of our oceans and protecting them, again, to the protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in partnership with the Gwich'in in Alaska, and then, of course, the broader issues around climate change, as we've discussed. And from all of these General Convention resolutions, we take particular advocacy actions, whether it's action alerts to the network of Episcopalians, the Episcopal Public Policy Network, or through our meetings with members of Congress and bringing Episcopalians to lift up their voices as advocates in Washington and then in their home districts.
Thank you, Rebecca. And so as you mentioned, over 10 pieces of legislation that we are approaching, be it on the Hill or ways in which we're encouraging each other to enter in a more prayerful manner of life and a way of love that include things like planting parish groves. We're encouraging Episcopalians to count their carbon offsets. We have a whole task force that's exploring the ways in which in our lives we can oppose environmental racism. And we're linking forces with all of our Episcopalians who are advocates with the UN supporting sustainable development goals. And as Rebecca mentioned, supporting water as a human right, the health of our oceans and biodiversity. So there's lots of ways in which we have been and continue to do this work and this ministry. And I'll turn this back over to Annie. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so we're really excited to be working with you all on, again, the great work that you've been doing and some of the ways that the Episcopal Church is eager to kind of dig in on this issue and expand the work. So what we're going to be doing today, again, is talking about how we talk about faith and climate in a variety of settings and giving you some guidance and some tools that you can use in a variety of different settings, whether you're preaching, teaching, or just sharing with your friends, family, and coworkers. But before I go into all of that, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about who is ecoAmerica and the Blessed Tomorrow program. So again, we are an organization that is working to inspire and empower institutional and individual leadership on climate. And we do this by helping partners to build their visible leadership on climate solutions, so making sure that this is a very clear priority for those institutions. We engage in the Blessed Tomorrow program. We engage clergy and leaders and congregations, just like this training. And we build collective action. So we have a variety of different programs. We have our faith program, which is Blessed Tomorrow, but we also have a program directed for health leaders called Climate for Health. This includes public health professionals, providers, hospitals, etc. We also have another program called Path to Positive, which is for community leaders, so your cities and counties, urban sustainability directors, etc. And again, what we're doing across all of these programs is trying to partner and collaborate to provide guidance and resources to support their climate leadership. We help them talk about climate successfully and engage constituents to act and advocate on climate solutions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I just want to say thank you to several of the members of your leadership who participate in our Blessed Tomorrow Leadership Circle. You'll see we have them highlighted here. It's a group of folks across the faith sector that we're able to learn from each other and collaborate when appropriate. So at ecoAmerica, we start with research to figure out how to better connect with all kinds of Americans. We conduct several types of research to inform our work, and then we share it broadly with anyone working to engage Americans on climate, such as you all here today. So we're not guessing. We conduct psychographic values research that helps us understand which Americans are ready to move on climate. Some aren't, some are. We learn a great deal about what they care about, and then we find out how to connect what they care about to solutions that they can implement themselves or with others. We conduct communications research, such as the steps that we're going to talk about today, but we do other types of research. We release monthly what we call climate perspective surveys. For example, our most recent surveys have looked at the connection Americans are making between extreme weather and climate change, and then also how Americans view climate change as a voting issue. And you can find all of this research at blessedtomorrow.org. And then lastly, we conduct message testing to find the specific language to use for authentic and faith-grounded and successful communication on this topic, which might be different than some of the other types of communications guidance that you've heard in the past. So quickly, I wanted to share the methodology of this training in particular. There were three main research best practices that we've used in the creation of Let's Talk Faith and Climate, and these include an analysis and summary of the latest communication research on climate and faith, with recommendations on how best to communicate. We also incorporated the results of tested words, phrases, and messages that were shown to resonate with Americans based on some focus groups that we did, and also a large survey, the American Climate Values Report. And finally, we relied on the perspective of those key faith leaders that I just mentioned earlier to assess this guide and to provide really faith-based insight and guidance. So the research was all packed together into this training to provide things that are shareable, that hopefully you can find easy to use, again, in a variety of different settings. So before we go into what those steps are and we start practicing together, and yes, we will be doing that together later, I thought it might be helpful to just dive into some specific examples and what's going on as the state of climate right now and some of the solutions. So these are just a set of some examples from The Hill, which is a publication that really talk about how more and more we are seeing and hearing about climate, the changing climate and its impacts. So these are affecting us, they're affecting our neighbors, not just here in the US, but certainly across the world. Just a few examples. So here you see the Arctic's thickest ice layer broke for the first time on record this year. We have longer fire seasons that are contributing to some of the historic forest fires we might have been reading about on the West Coast. Certainly the hurricanes are hitting with more frequency and intensity, as Melanie mentioned. We have heat waves that are causing a lot of health issues for particularly children and elderly. And some of you may have heard about some of the toxic algae blooms that are happening and it really inhibiting use of and some of the economy based around some of the beaches in Florida. But it's important that you know that there is some good news here, and we have solutions really that are allowing us to better care for creation, that are more prevalent and more embraced than ever before. So we have increased use of global solar. It's now 50% of all of the new power coming on in 2017. Wind and solar are now 10% of the US electricity grid. 75,000 new solar panels were installed. We have 58 US cities and 2 states who have pledged to go 100% clean energy, which is incredible. And there are major faith denominations making similar kinds of commitments. We've seen that from the United Church of Christ, from the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and certainly from the Episcopal Church with some of the recent announcements from your last General Convention. So again, great news here. There's a lot that we can be hopeful for, and in fact, we can all do something about it ourselves. And so that's what we'd like to talk about more, and how we communicate that. So hopefully, again, now that you understand how we go about research and where this training has been based in, I'd like to delve into how faith leads us to act on climate and American attitudes in that regard. So communicating effectively, it always begins with knowing your audience. And that's just really messaging 101, and many of you may have heard that before. But what do people of faith think about climate change? And how does faith fit into the values that Americans hold? So as I mentioned, climate change it's causing unprecedented harm to God's creation, and that includes us. And rather than discussing the environmental impacts that we're all seeing, again, all over the globe, this training is going to focus on providing the context of how climate change is connected to the core values of Christian faith. We know that climate change, it's a moral and spiritual issue. And like I mentioned, it's causing harm. And our faith can lead us to act for a multitude of reasons. And you can see here on the slide that many of these directly align with the impacts and solutions that we're talking about. So, whether your religious experience is strongly connected to God's creation, or maybe you're involved for peacemaking or alleviation of poverty, like Melanie mentioned, overcoming racism or care for the next generation, all of these faith-based values are directly connected back to support for climate solutions. So these solutions are helping to protect communities who are most affected by climate change, such as the poor. We are ensuring equity and justice, certainly in the midst of scarce resources. We're providing communities of people with recognized shared responsibility to become and be a sanctuary and refuge for those who are being impacted. We certainly saw incredible responses to some of those wildfires and hurricanes, and that's a role that people of faith have always and can continue to play, even though as those become more severe and extreme. So no matter where you live, faith leaders we know are the backbone of American communities. And during times of moral dilemma or when disasters striking, these leaders are certainly looked to for guidance. And in fact, we know that from some of our research. So our research shows that there's a growing opportunity here for faith-based climate leadership. 40% of Americans believe that religious leaders should take a stance on climate change, 40%. And 59% of the general public agree that taking action on climate change, it's necessary. 44% of those folks who see religion as the most important aspect of their lives say that they would trust and follow their faith leader for guidance on climate issues, which may surprise some people. So I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Meighen Speiser. She's going to talk about the findings of the survey that we recently conducted with the Episcopal Church, so we can show exactly what some of your responses are to some of these questions, and certainly the implications to these findings. So Meighen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Annie, and welcome everyone. And I also wanted to remind folks, if you do have a question at any time, you can chat them to us in the chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can send them to the organizers and we will have some time for Q&A at the end. So as Annie mentioned, we do a lot of research at ecoAmerica because knowledge is power and we don't guess. So one of the things we do for partners, including with you all, is something we call the American Climate Metrics Survey. And so in April of this year, we sent a survey out to clergy and to laity of the Episcopal Church, and we had 855 responses, 223 from clergy and 632 from laity. And what we do with this research, of course, is we look at it directly and what does it mean for the church. We also look at it in context of the findings from our national survey. So we run the same survey nationally, and we take a look, in this case, on how Episcopalians fare to the national averages. So that's what I'm going to take you through right now. There's a lot of good news in this survey. First and foremost, probably no surprise to you, and based on all the great progress at the convention, Episcopalians believe climate change is happening and have concern at higher rates than Americans do nationally, and as you'll see, much higher rates. Next slide. So taking a look first at belief and concern, excuse me, 97% believe climate change is happening, and that's versus 80% of Americans. Again, most Americans believe climate change is happening, but a vast majority of Episcopalians believe it is happening. And on par with that, 96% of you are personally concerned about climate change versus 76% of Americans nationally. One of the things we've seen over the years is a growing belief and growing concern nationally. So that is good news for all of us. There's another study out that says that Americans are concerned about climate change, but they're not sure that other people are. And so one of the reasons we share this survey findings with you is to let you know that you and others around you are very concerned about this issue and want to do something about it. We also take a look at causation. One of the measures of whether folks are going to act on the issue is looking at whether or not they believe that climate change is mainly caused by human activities. The percentages you see here from Episcopalians are really encouraging, some of the highest across all of our partners. 59% of you attribute climate change mainly to human activities, and that's more than double the US average. 38% believe it's a combination of human and natural causes, and together that's the vast majority, right? Only 1% of Episcopalians attribute climate change mainly to natural causes. And I want to just really stress the validity of these findings. When you have anywhere over 500 survey respondents, you have very high confidence in the findings. And considering we had over 800 Episcopalians take this survey, we can have very high confidence with really only 1% to 2% margins of error. So these findings are very promising. Next slide. Looking at the urgency, another aspect of looking at what motivates people to act on an issue is how urgent they feel this issue is for solving. And thankfully, 96% of Episcopalians agree we collectively need to take action now to reduce the pollution that is causing climate change. Again, nearly 20 points higher than US average, which is 77%. And 92% believe they personally need to take action now to reduce the pollution that is causing climate change. Well over 20% higher than national averages. I will point out, however, that getting into the 70th percentile on both of these two components for US nationally is really significant. I mean, 70% of Americans don't agree on much, but they are agreeing that we need to take action now to reduce the pollution that is causing climate change. And that's a very significant finding given all the rollbacks that are happening on the national scale. Agency. We also take a look at how Americans feel they can be part of the solution. How much power do they feel they personally have or we collectively have in addressing the problem? And good news among Episcopalians, again, that 96% of you believe we collectively can reduce the pollution that is causing climate change, and 90% believe I personally, or they personally, can reduce the pollution that's causing climate change. So real high sense of agency. You can see here 20+ more percentage higher than national average. So that's really a sense of, can-do-it-itivism, choking on my words there, but a sense of empowerment and being able to affect progress. Next slide. And on action. So the third thing that we measure as far as how people are engaging on the issue is, what are they currently doing to move the ball forward on climate change? So we measure a spectrum of actions, and we'll share them with you over these next few slides. 95% of Episcopalians have already discussed climate change with friends and family. That's a vast majority, certainly in comparison to the national average of 69%. 70% of you have discussed climate change at your place of worship, nearly 3 times the national average. So well done. And thank you to Melanie and her team and all the folks in the church that are working to bring climate change through the denomination. 67% have discussed climate change at work with colleagues, and that's much higher than the national average, which is only 41%. So that's really promising as well. So from an advocacy perspective and really just having the discussion, really strong numbers across the board. Moving into other forms of action, 93% of Episcopalians have upgraded appliances or lighting to conserve energy, and certainly that's within their own homes. So that's a third more than national averages of 66%. And here's also what's very promising and something to consider as we will be going to the polls in just 4 to 5 weeks. 84% of Episcopalians have contacted or voted for an elected official based on his or her support of climate solutions, and that's well over double the national average as of 2017. ecoAmerica is about to release a poll we just conducted that has even more promising numbers for the US nationally. I think since we did this survey a year ago and so many rollbacks have happened, Americans are more concerned and more willing to vote for an elected official based on their support for climate solutions. So you'll see that 35% raise closer to what Episcopalians already intended or would intend to do and vote for the elected official based on support. We also, Melanie and team asked us to put some custom questions into the survey just for Episcopalians, and it was really promising to see the good news here. 90+ percentile across all kinds of motivations for doing something about climate change. So we're really trying to see what really motivates Episcopalians most. And you can see here the breakdown, but anything over 80% is fantastic. So clearly what this shows is there's a spectrum of motivations. On the top of the list, of course, 98% said you should walk more gently on the earth and care for our creation. That's the rationale, with 95% strongly. Again, not many people click strongly agree on a survey, so the fact that 95% of you did is really shows how strong that value is amongst Episcopalians. 93% say religious beliefs compel them to address climate change. 76% strongly, still very strong numbers. 97% say religious beliefs compel you to address climate change because we must care for God's creation. So just a different way of saying the first point, but being very explicit and including the term climate change in there to see if it shifted people's responses, and really not by much at all. You could argue there's a margin of error and that it doesn't matter whether we talk about walking more gently on the earth or caring for creation, or actually just really plainly talking about climate change and connecting that with God's creation. There's little difference, which is promising. We ought to be able to speak about the issue if we're going to make progress on it. And certainly there's a lot of strong motivations around the most vulnerable, including children and the elderly. 92% say that, you know, they're compelled to act on climate because of this, 81% strongly, and certainly also similar numbers for the rationale of because climate more severely impacts the poor and the low-income communities of color. And promising, 91% say that your place of worship should do more to address climate change as part of their care for creation. And so this is really about leading by example and reducing impact within our own individual places of worship. So, excuse me, as we head into fall, I'm developing a little cold. With that in mind, so knowing that there's really strong values, awareness, beliefs, concerns, motivations on climate amongst Episcopalians, we'll now move into communications guidance. And as Annie mentioned, this is pulled from several different research projects. Everything that we will share has been rigorously tested, peer-reviewed, and proven to be effective with Americans who are middle on the issue, who may be not decided about climate change, and so this, you know, what we're sharing with you will help them get over the hurdle of being decided and engage and be motivated to act. And so what this guidance will help you do is really be very versatile in engaging people on this issue. You can use it to give a speech or have one-on-one conversations or small group conversation. You can use it to inform preaching and teaching as well. We specifically look at communications from multiple different angles to provide really guidance that helps empower you in multiple ways. Next slide. So part of what we looked at when we were beginning some of our most recent work on communications is taking a look at how messages on climate change have evolved over time. What you might be most familiar with is what we might call the Armageddon messaging, talking about global warming, talking about the impacts on polar bears and ice caps, doomsday kind of messaging. You still see this kind of messaging floating around, and it's really what galvanized a majority of the climate activists that are engaging on the issue today. What we find in our research that this type of messaging is highly motivating to the type of person who is an activist by nature. However, that's only about 8 to 10% of the population. In about 2008, a lot of climate nonprofits started talking about the social benefits of climate solutions. So switching the conversation completely to what is our opportunity on clean energy, is it green jobs, and talking about sort of really what are the benefits nationally to our economy and so forth. That also brought some new folks along. However, having a pure message just based on the social benefits fell a bit short. And so what we know today is that it really is about personal relevance. People need to feel personally connected to the issue because it's felt so remote and abstract. They need to understand how it connects with them and how solutions benefit them. And so our task as advocates and what we focus this training on is really connecting in with personal relevance. And so what really do we mean by that? It means salient climate impacts that people can see with their own eyes in their own lives, which unfortunately is more prevalent these days. Also, when we're talking about solutions, talking about making them tangible as well, so unambiguous, talking about proven solutions that solve the problem, and certainly also how they benefit us. We also need to make sure that we talk about the fact that we can all make a difference on this issue. So many people hear the opposite, and we'll go into that more in a minute, but people need to hear that a lot is happening on climate change. They personally can do something to act. They really need that motivation that they personally can be in part of the solution. And also, personal relevance means moral imperative. We've talked about it a bit, but Americans need to hear it more. What is the moral imperative for acting on this issue? So as I mentioned before, we rigorously test language. So we do all of this primary research to really inform a message construct. And then we actually take messages into what's called dial testing, where people listen to the message and they dial up if they like it and they dial down if they don't like it. And we do several rounds of this dial testing to really net out a message that will cause people to what we call dial up the entire time. So not only do they like the message, but we also do before and after surveys to prove that when they hear this message, it changed their motivation to act on the issue. And so when we share this message, which is on screen right now, we have high confidence that it really helps to move people towards climate action. And as we've said before in the previous webinar, think about this message as opening the message on climate, right? So this is really how to start conversations with people on this issue, to really get them to open their minds and listen and be inspired. Certainly, as we will walk through the rest of this training, you'll see also how to create your own personal message as well. But to start, we have this successful message, which is we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards for God's creation. God so loved us that God created a pure, clean home here on earth, vibrant with healthy nature that provides for our needs. He also gave us the free will to choose how we care for that earth. Let's follow the golden rule and do unto others and our earth as we would have done unto ourselves and our children. For too long, the priorities of a greedy few have forced our climate out of balance, degrading God's creation, damaging our land, water, and air, and harming us all, especially the least among us. We must care more fully for creation and walk more gently upon his earth. And so this message, you can see it's a Christian message. It resonated with a majority of Americans, regardless of their denomination affiliation. And certainly what we talk about with our faith partners is that this can be customized based on your faith tradition, but a great way to open the conversation. Moving into why some of the words that were used in that message work, using the term good steward versus others that we tried. Some people believe that climate change is not intentional, and meaning that they didn't directly break a moral law by not doing something about it. What we're trying to do in using that phrase good steward is to show that we all have a role in being part of the solution. So being very positive about it versus negative as well. Part of also using the term golden rule was really to bring in more familiar nonpartisan faith-based language. But as this says on the screen, depending on your faith tradition, you can sort of switch that phrase out with loving your neighbor or climate justice and so forth. And you can see here some of the other sort of guidance around words and phrases to embrace versus those to avoid. Certain things like saying wind and solar are more straightforward. For instance, the more we can avoid jargon and really use language that people understand, use language that's visible and very clear, the better we do in our communications. We want to avoid jargon because people people's brains will do what's called shutting down. They'll associate it with, you know, maybe something or someone that they don't identify with. And the intention when you're delivering a communication is to make sure people's minds stay open and with you, and that you're connecting with them. Next slide. In our guide, which I believe we have a link to at the end of this webinar, we also provide key talking points. Understanding that a message opens the conversation, we also recognize that most people, when they're talking about climate, it's in a conversational format. And so in the guide, we provide all sorts of talking points that you can follow when you're part of a conversation. We also provide common counterpoints that people make and responses that you can use as part of your conversation. So really trying to think about how we approach conversations very holistically. So all of that is in the guide. So I believe now I'm turning it back to Annie, who will take us through a stepwise process for creating your own successful and personalized message.
Great, yeah, thanks Meighen, and thanks for that great background information. It again is very promising, and I think a great way to feel empowered and compelled to think about what we're going to be sharing with you next. So to help everyone kind of use the communication guidance, we usually prepare kind of a personal message or a sample survey or sermon that we can share with you, just so you can get a better idea of what effective climate communication looks like for people of faith. And so in the guide, we actually have a sample sermon. Again, as Meighen mentioned, this is just a sample. It's something that could certainly be tweaked and modified based on different traditions. But I thought I'd go ahead and read it to you all, because we're going to use it as a basis for going through the communication steps in just a moment. So I'll go ahead and do that now. If you have access to the guide, feel free to follow along. Brothers and sisters, we as a congregation have experienced a great deal together. Through good times and bad, we know that it is God who makes both us and you stand firm in Christ, as we read in 2 Corinthians. With God's love, there is no obstacle we cannot overcome together. When our church needed a new roof, we made it happen. When members of our congregation needed sponsorship to embark on a missions trip, we rallied together and sent them. And today, I invite us to come together again to face another challenge. For some of us, the term climate change conjures thoughts of something over there, happening in a faraway land to someone else. Maybe not a problem for us. But we can all see the damage that is being done to the climate and the impact that this is having on us. It's negatively affecting our health and well-being. For example, my godson's asthma put him in the emergency room last month. And when you add these health impacts to the damage that severe weather and storms have caused to our community over this past year, it's clear that our changing climate is changing us. Right now, more than 300 million people around the world suffer from asthma and other respiratory diseases, 25 million of whom reside right here in the United States of America. And that's 1 in every 12 people, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Those who are most likely to be affected are our children. They're our grandparents. Our families and God's beautiful creation are being impacted by the world we are creating. The good news is that there's something that you, and all of us can do about it. We are starting a creation care committee here at the church to work on projects that will restore the gift we have been given to its intended glory. What we do locally impacts us globally. The creation care committee will not only work toward curbing damage done to the climate, it will also find energy efficient practices to implement here at the church, which saves us money right now. Every week, our collection plate is full, for which the church is extremely grateful. But think about how much further that collection could go if we reduced the cost of operating our sanctuary. We can achieve this vision by studying these practices through exploratory committees that will investigate clean energy options, maybe evaluate wind and solar programs here, and uncover ways in which we can collaborate with our city. I spoke to Rabbi Schmidt at the synagogue across the street, and he said that their creation care committee has helped their temple implement solar programs, energy efficient lighting, and recycling programs that have already saved them over $1,000 a month, money that they have put towards helping families in need. And if Rabbi Schmidt can achieve this kind of success, so can we. So as you leave here today, Our deacons will be waiting outside, ready to sign you up for our first Creation Care Committee meeting this Wednesday evening at 7. I need as many of your voices as possible to help us organize, engage, and move forward on this exciting project that will glorify God's name. Together, we can make this happen. We can do our part to help erase the impacts that are hurting our community. We can reduce our pollution levels and serve as a role model for other congregations. Together, we can care for our common home and the least of those who inhabit God's creation, as Jesus calls us to do. Climate change is having a real impact on our communities. God has given us the profound responsibility of stewarding his creation, and we can do just that. It's time that we rise up above the arguments and move together as a unified voice, carrying God's message forward and demonstrating it through our actions. God bless all of you, and please don't forget to sign up for our first ever Creation Care Committee meeting. So thank you for listening to that. But as demonstrated in this message, this going to move forward here. The steps on this screen here, they serve as guidance for drafting, for delivering communications in a way that can appeal personally to your audience. So as Meighen mentioned, these guidelines are drawn from research, and for the sake of time, I'm going to use just the first half of the message that I read through most of this, but just lightly touch on the rest of it. So first, we'll talk about building rapport. It's really important to start a message knowing your audience, as I mentioned earlier, and connecting with people at the very beginning. So what does this mean? The first step is starting with people and staying with people. This is about making your communication about your audience and truly showing it. So doing your homework. Start from their perspective, not from your perspective. So if you're talking to a colleague or a parishioner or a fellow person of faith, just really take into account their perception of faith and climate. A question to help answer this might be something like, what sort of situation does my audience encounter on a day-to-day basis? This also means talking about people first versus technology, policy, or the planet. This step also notes the importance to refer back to the audience throughout your communication. So the next step is to connect on common values. And this step is about building common ground with your audience. So you open your audience's hearts and minds first by discussing values and showing your congregation really how deeply held those values are and how they're similar to or really the same as your own. Eventually, we'll talk about how they align with climate solutions. You connect on first on the values that bring your congregation together. For example, faith, family, and community. You can make it clear that you understand your audience's daily priorities. Doing all of this early in your communication, it builds rapport, it provides a stronger foundation from which to move into talking about climate change. So when we say common values, what are we talking about? These are things like faith, family, health, and community. We know that these are some of the top values held by a majority of Americans. And we know this again from our own research. In high majorities, Americans, again, across political spectrums, across faith traditions, resonate with faith. Family is second, and well-being of future generations. And we hear a lot in the news today in messaging, in news articles and in broadcasting, a focus on children's health impacts. So just to show you kind of what this looked like, again, as I was reading, I really focused on we as a congregation. So I started with us. We've experienced a great deal together, and I talked about connecting on common values. So I've specifically referenced a scripture passage that kind of really encompasses our general beliefs and what we're all about. All right, so the third step, so we talked about the first, start with people, stay with people. We've talked about connecting on common values. So the next piece is really important, and it's to acknowledge ambivalence. So I'm sure you know this, but in every crowd, you're going to have a skeptic. And if your communications come across too one-sided right off the bat, you're going to cause people to shut down, as Meighen mentioned, and they're just not going to keep listening to you. So we really need to create space for those differing opinions. You can think of a simple line such as, we have a variety of views regarding climate change in our community, and allowing people to just be comfortable with the fact that they have a different opinion so that they can continue to listen to you with as much of an open mind as possible. And we want your congregation to really feel comfortable and kind of gently introduced to the concept in a non-threatening way. All right, so step 4, you can make it real. So we're talking about allowing space for those different opinions, and then specifically talking about what is the local reality for people? How can we see and feel this in our own lives? I used the example of a fictional godson who's dealing with asthma, and kind of what that looks like around the country and around the world. So I focused on impacts that people can see with their own eyes. You could also, if you're in a community that's experienced a wildfire or a hurricane, or you've had individuals go and respond to some of those things, you could use those as an example. We would just recommend that you only mention 1 or 2 climate impacts, because as Meighen mentioned, with that Armageddon kind of doomsday messaging, people can get really overwhelmed, and we want to move the conversation from impacts really quickly to solutions. And here are just some examples of where you can find information on impacts. Google is a wonderful thing, but there are some great resources on federal websites. All right, so after we've connected on common values, here I'm acknowledging the ambivalence, specifically again by talking about, for some of us, this is happening in a faraway place. It's not something that's really relevant to us in our daily lives. But I'm also, again, directly connecting it back to something that we've seen in our community. It's easier for the audience to visualize and probably connect with a similar experience maybe that they've had or seen recently. So that's the first bucket. We've built rapport, and now we move to inspiring and empowering. So the first of these steps is to emphasize solutions. We are, just like the example, once you've touched on a local or personal impact, you can go ahead and talk about specific examples of what's being done in that community. We want to build climate concern, but we also want to prevent people from kind of turning into a fatalistic thinking. So your audience needs to hear that solutions, they're tangible, they're effective. You can highlight specific solutions that have been or are maybe scheduled to be locally implemented. Some communities are doing more than others. Again, this is knowing your homework, doing your homework, and knowing your audience. So remember, avoid asking anyone to sacrifice. This is really important. Your audience, they don't want to hear that. And so you want to come from a personal place and talk about personal benefits. So again, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired. So therefore, step 6 here, inspire and empower, is very important. We need to have messages about climate change that are not doom and gloom, causing people to shut down, but instead that we're highlighting, what congregations and faith communities are benefiting from. I used an example of a sister congregation across the street that's had some benefits. So again, just to call out some of the examples, since you don't all have the sermon right in front of you, emphasizing solutions. We're starting a creation care committee, so there's something very tangible that people can get involved in right away. And I'm inspiring and empowering by saying that this is going to help us not only, live our values and address climate change, but we're also going to save money, and that's something that we can reinvest into the ministries that are important to us. All right, now step 7. We're almost there, I promise. So we're focusing on personal benefit. So this is really part of the climate conversation that's been missing to date, as Meighen mentioned, and it's where we're really trying to promote and kind of push people towards with our trainings and our guidance. We want to deepen that personal relevance, and that actually creates motivations for solutions. So Americans currently think climate action is going to cost them, and we know the opposite can actually be true. So for people of faith, it's really critical to emphasize how these solutions advance not only, again, the values and the mission of your own tradition across all of the communications that you're using. We really can't stress this enough, that this is really important. So what do we talk about when we say personal benefits? This is a list, but there are certainly many more. I think might not be a surprise to many of you that costs and budgets really are a top motivator for people and moving them to action, and being able to talk about some of the cost savings, whether you're implementing something personally or as a congregation, can be very motivating. Health, again, is also a top motivator, and as I mentioned, especially health of children. We actually, Blessed Tomorrow and ecoAmerica just released some new talking points connecting children's health and climate change. So we do that on a bi-monthly basis. We produce new talking points on different issues that can really be a complement to this training and the work we're doing together today. And then, of course, care of neighbor and improving the community is another top motivator. All right, here's the last step, almost. End with your ask. So again, messaging 101, you always want to leave people with something that they can do immediately. It's a crescendo to this messaging. So we want to ask them to invest some in maybe clean energy, or to talk to their fellow congregants about creation care. Or maybe there's some citywide efficiency program going on. Maybe you're doing work with lower income communities providing resources, and you want to help them save money by installing LED light bulbs or reducing their energy use through weatherization, etc. So it's really up to you to decide what suits your audience. The ask certainly needs to align with their own understanding and their personal values. It can encompass one or two ideas perhaps, but we would just recommend keeping them accessible and really straightforward, because as you can imagine, too many options can be overwhelming and confusing, and this is already a topic that can sometimes elicit that kind of feeling from people. And certainly you can always build on that initial ask. So if you're starting small, maybe you come back in a week, a month, or a year to do more. So again, just an example of what this looked like in my own sample sermon, which again is in the Let's Talk Faith and Climate Guide. I highlighted how the church efficiency work can save money, and I asked the audience to be a part of the solution, and that's actually how I ended the message. All right, so we've just walked through 8 steps. 8 might seem like a lot, but it's important that these are actually done in the right sequence. We have research that shows that the same 6 facts can be arranged in a variety of different ways, and they actually lead to people having a different understanding of what you were talking about. So again, if you start negative and impersonal, it's really hard to get people back to positive and to feel like this is personally relevant to them. You'll lose them, they'll shut down, as Meighen mentioned. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how you strengthen your message. So it takes practice, but there are some things that you can do to try to help make sure that your message is going to be delivered. So again, describe, don't label. We get stuck a lot of times using these very technical terms to talk about climate change, which can cause the audience to feel distant. Avoid jargon, things like maybe you've heard mitigation, renewable energy, but instead use some kind of visual phrases like clean energy. Trusted messengers, knowing who the best messenger is really important. I referenced a personal connection, and then I also referenced the Centers for Disease Control to try to lend credibility to the proposed solutions. Ditch doom and gloom, as we mentioned many times. It's a reminder to be positive and motivating. I, in the sample, avoided resignation by citing one climate-related impact, but then I quickly turned the focus of the conversation to solutions that are going to help save money. And again, stories that strengthen engagement. So research tells us that storytelling, it enhances engagement and information retention. And I gave that example about my fictional godson. Again, hopefully connecting with people and having them think about their own example of someone that they know who might be living with asthma. So ultimately, the story enhances rapport, and it certainly motivates action. So stay above the fray. We don't need to get political here. Just stay in the big picture, avoid argument, and focus on the common ground. And finally, message discipline. It's really critical. I kept the audience's attention. I was clear and concise. And it just makes it easier for people to understand and certainly to remember, and then hopefully to share with others. So maintaining this consistency with a single communication is important, but it's certainly important then to reiterate it across communication platforms, whether you're tweeting information out or you're writing a speech or a sermon, a bulletin, insert, a blog, whatever it might be. All right, so here are the 9 steps. It seems like a lot, but to make it easier to remember, just think of them in these 3 buckets. We've got building rapport, inspiring and empowering, and strengthening your message. All right, are you guys ready to practice? I hope so. All right, so this is an actual listing of messages from very real communications from some folks in the environmental movement. We've kind of cobbled them together here. But I'm just curious, how would you edit this? Knowing and having heard the steps that we've just walked through. You can chat your thoughts here in the chat box, but read this and think about those 3 buckets: building rapport, inspiring and empowering, and strengthening. What would you do differently? And we'll give folks a moment to review and again, chat your thoughts in the chat box. So there should be some things pretty clearly called out here. We're certainly starting with the science and the technology. We're not really starting with people, right? So if there's someone who's already a climate change questioner, they're not quite sure how they feel about it, they don't quite understand how it's relevant to them, we're starting right off with scientists agree climate change. So they've already turned their ears off and they're not really listening to you anymore. The message has a lot of kind of negative, almost shaming language. We talk about the costs are going to be great. The Armageddon language that you might remember from the polar bear picture. We go into a lot of great detail about what's happening and what the impacts are. People are going to kind of tune out and stop listening at that point. And there really isn't an ask at the end. We're not asking anyone to do anything or take action, except maybe eating less meat, which I can tell you is certainly a way to have people stop listening to you in certain parts of the country. So you want to think about things that are actually going to engage people, make them feel like this is personally relevant, and allowing them to make the choice about how they're going to act and move forward. Any other thoughts before we move on? Again, you can chat your comments into the chat function. All right, it looks like we have the same kind of comments, so thanks everyone. Again, we'll share these slides and the training is being recorded, so you can come back to this or use it as an example with folks if you'd like to. All right, so now we would like to offer an opportunity for you all to practice a little more. This can be homework for you. Perhaps some of you are clergy who have to write a sermon in some of the next weeks here. Maybe you're working in a congregation and you want to write a blog or put something in your bulletin or share this with others, family members, colleagues, coworkers, friends. But we'd like you to create your own message. I am actually going to show in just a moment some of the lessons that are actually appointed for use on October 21st in the Episcopal lectionary. And you could consider using those. We're also going to show you an example of a passage from the Catechism that you might think about using, maybe for a Bible study or a Sunday school lesson. So think about those topics. You could pick your own as well. Who's your audience? Are you communicating with congregants? Are you talking to leaders, maybe a church council? Are you talking to the general public? Maybe policymakers or other leaders in your community, maybe another congregation. And think about what is the medium that this is going to be delivered? Is it something like a sermon? Is it, again, something like a Bible study, a blog, a speech, etc.? So, interestingly, again, these are the lessons that are appointed for October 21st. We have a passage from Job here, Job 38, 1 through 7, and 34 through 41. So if you have your Bibles ready, you can write this down, but I'll put this back up in just a moment. We have Psalm 104, 1 through 9, 25, and 35b. Some really interesting language here that you might think about pulling out and calling to in a message. Mark 10, 35 through 45. And again, the Catechism. So this is page 845, Q1 through 3. And I'll go ahead and read this one. This is the human nature. Oops. What are we by nature? We are part of God's creation, made in the image of God. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? It means that we are free to make choices, to love, to create, to reason, and to live in harmony with creation and with God. Why then do we live apart from God and out of harmony with creation? Well, from the beginning, human beings have misused their freedom and made wrong choices. So a very relevant message here. All right, so this is the practice. Again, those are the four optional passages to consider, but again, you could consider your own. And these are the steps: building rapport, inspiring and empowering, and strengthening. Sometimes we run this training in person and we actually have you sit and practice for 15 minutes and write something out, build an outline, but because we're virtual today, we'll give this to you as homework. But before we move into the remainder of the call, again, in the chat function, do you have questions about this? Are there things within these passages that immediately kind of call out to you as elements that you might pull on to create your own message? Go ahead and chat those questions in the chat function. We'll give you about just maybe 30 seconds and see if we get any questions before we move on. We had someone say, I don't think many of us even realized that the Book of Common Prayer says so much about creation care. Well, there it is for you. It does. And there are a lot of connections that you can make, that just to draw people's attention that they also might not be making the connection. We do have a calling here. All right, talking about our own experiences with creation care can be powerfully motivating. So someone, yes, it certainly can. And again, remember to emphasize that personal benefit, that personal connection. Tell your story. Storytelling is incredibly powerful. All right, so this is your homework. And again, we'll share this out with everyone. But we highly encourage you to join and to follow Blessed Tomorrow as we provide this and another suite of resources to all of our partners. We work with many of the large denominations throughout the United States, including the Episcopal Church. We have other sector guides, so if you have an interest in how we're building resources for the health sector or the local government sector, you can check those out as well. And we will continue to partner with the Episcopal Church on these webinars and in-person trainings, those ongoing surveys, which we'll be running on an annual basis, and other resources as well, like the talking points that come out bi-monthly, and the additional research that we do on a monthly basis. Another thing that I wanted to mention to everyone, so this communications training is will be part of a broader program that is called the Blessed Tomorrow Ambassadors Training Program. And it'll be a 3-part training where you can learn to, again, connect climate and faith. You'll understand the solutions that are needed to address changing climate. And again, the similar training to the communications piece, so we can talk about how you share this information with others, and especially with policymakers. So some of the great work that Rebecca Linder-Blakely, who was on earlier, is doing at the national level. Hopefully this communications training and other training can help you engage in that more as you're able. So I will at this point turn it back over to Melanie to go ahead and close it out, see if we have any other questions. We're here to answer them. And we can help you all with some extra time today. Melanie?
Yes, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm so glad we were able to hear all those wonderful techniques. I think my preaching might even get a little better, and every stretch of the imagination to your wonderful work and research on what helps us get messages across. We want to make this training available to the entire Episcopal Church. We had a little taster at General Convention. People were really thrilled about that, and the next step was, when is it going to be online? So I am very thankful that the folks at the Office of Government Relations, our communications department, are committed to sort of redesigning our Creation Care website so that this will be online, but also we're going to offer this again, and the resources and many tools that we have to make available so people can do this ministry at your church, in your diocese. But I don't know if there were any questions, comments, ideas. If you don't have any now, feel free to email us or call us. Let us know what the church could be doing about creation care, and to help get this message out that we are all people that are caring for creation. And as Bishop Curry says, God's got the whole world in God's hands, and we are here to help out. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. Well, we don't see any other questions today, but again, please feel free to message us, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And I've linked here to the Let's Talk Faith and Climate Guide, which again, we walked through the steps with you today. We walked through the sample sermon. We talked about those talking points that you can use. And it's actually available at the advocacy.episcopal website here. So please feel free to download and share it with others. And please stay tuned. We hope you do stay connected and that you are interested in participating in future trainings, including the Ambassadors Program. So that will conclude the training for today. Thanks again for joining us. And again, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again.